For the last 6 months, the most powerful Chaos Space Marine builds have centered around Chaos Terminators. However, Arcs of Omen has just come along, and not only have our Terminators gone up in price, but the Loyalist counterparts have gone down in price in terms of points cost per model. So what I wanted to do today is talk about whether or not these points cost increases make Chaos Terminators no longer viable in the current tournament meta, and if they aren't viable, what are some alternative builds that people can pivot into to make sure that your Chaos Space Marine list is still as powerful as ever. So with that being said, let's just jump straight into this video talking about Chaos Terminators in competitive Warhammer 40k.
Welcome to the Black God.
G'day guys, welcome to today's episode. I wanted to take a quick second to respond to one of the most common questions that I've been asked since Arcs of Omen came out. And that is, are Chaos Space Marine Terminators still viable with the points increase that they got and the various, changes to the, meta and all those sorts of things? And it's not as simple of an answer, so I sometimes struggle to respond to the messages with a response because there's a lot of things that need to be considered when deciding whether or not Chaos Terminators are still viable. So let's just first do a bit of a recap on what this unit used to be in its glory days, where it used to be 350 to 400 point unit depending on your loadout, supported by a couple of 100 points worth of characters with some command points as well. So it was a pretty heavy investment, but you basically had this nigh unkillable Death Star that was a real problem for a lot of armies to deal with. They just straight up could not deal with it. It was very, very powerful. It was arguably overpowered, right? But there were certain armies that could deal with it, which made it a risky decision to run it in tournaments, because if you go up into one of the armies that could beat you, then you're in a lot of trouble. And I actually think that with the points changes, that dynamic hasn't necessarily changed. So yes, they've become more expensive, but by roughly 50 odd points when you factor in the extra 3 points per guy that went up, so that's 30 points for the unit. And then Marcus Slanesh, that went up as well. And then, other factors like your characters, for example, that previously took Marcus Slanesh, they all went up in points as well. So, holistically, you're looking at roughly 50 points extra in a list. But I don't think that's enough to necessarily change that dynamic. The bigger change, and the change that I think is more of a kick in the balls for them, is the loss of Armor of Contempt. Now, my initial thoughts on this were that it's not that big of a problem because we have a multi-layered defense, right? Part of our defense is the fact that we're really hard to hit with Illusory Supplication, making it so you can't hit us on a 1, 2, or a 3, and you can't reroll to hit. That's a massive defensive buff. Then we're also really hard to wound because we're typically going in at toughness 5 thanks to mutated invigoration, and then we have -1 to be wounded from the Black Rune of Damnation, so we're really hard to wound. So once you factor in those two things, then you get to the armor save point, which just got a slightly worse. And then on top of that, we then generally will have a 5-up save to shrug off those wounds thanks to Delightful Agonies. So it's sort of a 4-tiered defense setup on the Terminators. So my initial thought was that if one of those layers is weakened, which is the armor save, it's not that big of a deal because we have multiple layers of defensive, power. So having one of them, sacrificed slightly isn't that big of a deal. However, I find that the Terminators are one of those units that, if your opponent can dispatch them, you're just going to lose the game, right? That's because once you've lost the Terminators, all of your buffing characters have nothing to buff, and therefore they're all pretty much sacrificed as well, and you're playing 1,000 points down, which is just, no one can win a game when they're playing 1,000 points down. It just can't be done. And often what I was finding before the nerfs were people would fire their whole army in and they'd kill like maybe 5 Terminators. But this was fine because then I'd resurrect one, get up to 6 Terminators, and then those 6 Terminators were sufficient to do enough damage to, you know, really mess with your opponent's army. Whereas now with Armor of Contempt, instead of losing 5, you know, 4 or 5, you're losing like 6 or 7. And that's a very big difference in a lot of ways. Like, you may think of it as like it's only maybe 1 extra Terminator, whoop-de-doo. But the problem is it's only a unit of 10, so 1 extra Terminator is actually an extra, you know, 10% of the unit is dead. And then on top of that, it impacts your ability to make your morale check. And if you fail that morale check, you know, because losing, you know, if you lose 4, you can't fail because they're leadership 10. If you lose 5, you're only failing on a 6. But if you lose 6, well, now you're failing on a 5 or 6. Or even worse, if you lose 7, now you're failing on a 4, 5 or 6. So the second you start pushing into that higher casualty range, you actually start seriously risking losing more models to morale. And then when you do combat attrition, you'll be below half strength, so you'll be losing another 1 or 2, you know, on a roll of 1 or 2, you'll lose more models. So the swing actually goes from, you know, previously you were losing 4 or 5 and then passing your morale, right? And then you were resurrecting 1 in the following turn, so now you were back up to, say, 6 guys left, maybe even 7. And then you were going in with practically the whole squad. Whereas now you're losing, you know, 6, maybe 7 guys. Then you're failing morale, so you're losing, you know, 7 or 8 guys. And then combat attrition, you're losing, you know, 8 or 9 guys. So that 1 extra casualty actually has the potential to wipe out the unit, even though, and you know, and so say you lose, let's be on the conservative side, and say they kill 5 Terminators, and then you fail morale, so they killed 6, and then you know, lose 1 more to combat attrition, so now you're down to 4, like they've killed 7. So then when you resurrect 1 in your next turn, you've got 4 guys left, as opposed to the previous scenario where you had 7 guys left. So losing 1 extra model has the potential to effectively become 3 extra models dead. So that is a concern. Now, of course, you can auto pass your morale check, but that is 2 command points, and this list has other plans for those command points. They're not planning to spend them on fucking morale checks. Like, so the Terminators are a lot more vulnerable than they used to be, is I guess the point that I'm trying to make. And their whole strength of that build is that Terminator unit is invulnerable. You know, being able to say this Terminator unit can't die, then your opponent goes, okay, I'm not even going to bother trying. They're going to just put their guns elsewhere. And when they do that, they lose, because that Terminator unit will do serious damage to them over the course of the game. It's objective secured generally. If you take it in Iron Warriors or Black Legion or Alpha Legion even, they all have ways of making that Terminator unit objective secured. So you just go, cool, well, I'm taking the center of the battlefield, I'm holding that, I'm holding my backfield with other units, so I'm holding 2 objectives all game. So most missions, that's going to get you 8 points of primary every fucking turn, which is enough to get you to max it, right? And then combo that in with doing some sub-primary stuff, and you know, maybe you get a turn or 2 where you hold more than them. You know, that gives you your maximum primary. And then the rest of your army, because your Terminators are holding that center, the rest of your army can focus on securing secondaries. So if your opponent decides to ignore those Terminators, they're essentially saying you can have max primary, I'm not going to try and stop you. And that's a huge problem. Further to that, when you realize, oh, I just had 2 early turns of 12 primary, that means I don't need to hold the center in later turns. Well, now those Terminators can run amok in your opponent's backfield. You know, they can bully your opponent off of their objectives. They can take out the elements of your opponent's list that scored them their secondaries. They can mess with your opponent's secondaries. So ignoring the Terminators was always a disastrous move, and the smart players would always just go, you know what, I actually have to hurt it. I have to kill that Terminator unit down to a point where it's no longer combat effective. Which was, you know, always a challenge, right? So that was the beautiful paradox of that Terminator build, was that you had to kill it, but you couldn't kill it. So it was a bit of a paradox your opponent had to try to navigate. That's less true now than it was before. But there's one thing that's worth noting here. So for example, if you were going to an 8-round, you know, super major event, you're probably not going to take the Terminator build. because if you did, there will be at least 1 or 2 armies that you'll go up against that will have the firepower or the combat damage or the psychic output to just kill that unit. And that means that means you just can't win, right? Because they'll put some screening unit out front, so you can't turn 1 deep strike charge whatever their damage dealer is. Like, let's say you're versing some kind of crazy Tyranid monster list where there's a whole bunch of those Maleceptors or whatever they're called, where they put out a whole ton of psychic damage. And then you go up against that and they go, cool, all of these big monsters are hidden behind a wall of gaunts. You can't get to them. So your turn, you spend your turn killing gaunts, and then they bring out all their psychics and they just blow your Terminators to hell. You can't win that game. There's no, if your opponent's competent, there's no mechanism for you to navigate around that. Save some luck, perhaps. So, as a result, you wouldn't take it to an 8-round super major if your intent was to go undefeated and win the event. However, you would probably take like MSU, Emperor's Children or something like that. However, if your goal is to go to that 8-round super major and win 6 games and lose 2, or if you're going to like a 5-round GT and you're happy to go 4 wins and a loss, you're happy to go, even if you're happy to go 3 wins, 2 losses, if your goal is to just place higher than average, just place above the halfway line in the rankings, if that's your goal, then the Terminators are still absolutely fantastic. And the reason I say that is because there are certain armies that just can't deal with those Terminators. Certain armies that will just blow their entire load, they'll blow every bullet they have, and they will barely scratch the surface. And those games, you just automatically win. You just walk into that game and you're just like, yep, cool. You can't hurt my Terminators. Everything else is in strategic reserves or is hidden behind things or is, whatever. So you go, cool, you can't kill me. I can kill you, and I'm holding all the objectives. I win. And then you've got your opponent on the back foot. There's no way that they can win. So I think the Terminators are very binary. They're very you either will definitely win or you will definitely lose. Whereas if you want to have a little bit more control over your placings and you want to go for that, more undefeated, energy, you're going to need to pivot your list off of the Terminators, because otherwise you're playing with fire. It's entirely possible that you'll get 5 matchups where they just can't deal with your Terminators and you're just like, yep, sick, that's 5-0, I win the event because I got lucky with the pairings and nobody paired into me that could kill the Terminators, so I win. But that's very unlikely, because most top tier players, the ones that you're going to have to beat in order to win an event, are going to be running something that can deal with units like Chaos Terminators. Even though they are becoming less prevalent in the meta, so people will consider them less, people still will consider them, because you generally speaking, you don't want to run a list that has a dark red matchup, like a matchup where you're like, it's just going to lose no matter what I do. If there's an army out there that can beat you without you having a single chance of winning, well then you need to reassess your army and you need to take something different, because you need to factor that in. So yeah, I guess that's kind of my response to, are the Terminators still viable? Like, yes, they are, depending on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to go undefeated, then no, I don't think the Terminators are viable. I think if your goal is to win the event, you probably want to pivot off the Terminators, because all it takes is that one bad matchup and you have no ability to really turn that into a win. Whereas if your goal is to just win 3 out of 5 or win 6 out of 8, or something like that, if that's what your goal is, well then hell yeah, the Terminators can absolutely get you there. And not only can they get you there, they'll help you get there. They'll make it easy for you to get there, because there'll be certain matchups where you'll pair into it and you'll just be like, oh cool, my opponent can't do any damage to me. That's cool. That's a very, very powerful tool to have in your toolkit. And there's actually lots of armies, in my opinion, that just can't scratch that Terminator unit. Further to this, I guess the Terminator unit is still a very viable option in a teams event. So team events where you've got 4 players versus 4 players, and you have like the little pairings exercise at the start where you put forward a list and then they put forward a counter, and you go back and forth and you work out who's going to play who. Those sorts of events, like your team championships, they are where the Terminator build of Chaos Space Marines will shine. And that's because you get some agency over who your opponent is going to be. You know, if the enemy team puts up a list that you know the Terminators are really good into, well, then you put the Terminators up, and now your opponent's just like, okay, cool, I can't scratch it. You know, like a real combat-heavy Drakari list can't fucking touch that Terminator unit, because it's MSU. If they have to throw multiple units in, because they only really do damage in combat, so they have to throw multiple units into you, and then first one fights, does fuck all, and then you get to Marcus Lanesh interrupt, and you just wipe out everything they've thrown into you. So they can't engage you in combat, they can't kill you with shooting, it means they just can't do shit. And then in return, your bolters are just putting down units like it's nobody's business. Like, they're so good at killing Drakari MSU stuff. Even big things like Grotesques, you're just putting it down with bolter fire, really, really effective. You know, with the reroll hits and wounds from Abaddon, you're just very, very easily dispatching those units. So if the other team has a Drakari player, you just go, cool, well, let's make sure that the Chaos Space Marine player versus that Drakari player, and we're going to get a win, and there's nothing the opponent can do about it. So that's, you know, a very strong way to wield Terminators in teams environments. But in terms of singles, if you're building a list to go to a singles event, I think before you decide whether or not Terminators are a viable thing, like, because there's a lot of people poo-pooing them on the internet, saying, nah, they're no good, they've been nerfed to oblivion, they're too expensive now. Loss of Armor of Contempt means that they die too easily, which means that they're not able to fulfill the role that they used to fulfill, which was the invulnerable unit. And all of those things, whilst, you know, are true to an extent, if your goal is to just go 3-2, or, you know, 6-2 or whatever, you know, like, your goal is to just win as many games as you can, and you're accepting that you'll lose a couple, then fuck yeah, like, definitely get on the Terminator train. You know, don't get off at this station, you know, like, keep going, because that's still got plenty of gas, you know. And it doesn't really matter what Legion as well, like, they're still good in most Legions. I do think that the Black Legion Terminators are the far superior Terminators, and that's mainly because they've got all those bolters get reroll to hit and wound, thanks to Abaddon. And also in melee they get the reroll hits and wounds, which just means that they even when they do kill you down to only having 4 or 5 Terminators left, they still do massive amounts of damage. So I think the Black Legion ones do them the best. Now, just to sort of round out this video, the question then becomes, well, should you use Chosen, who are now like 11 points cheaper or whatever it is, like ridiculously cheap compared to the Terminators? So should you just run the Chosen instead? And I think the answer to this is, it depends on what you're doing with them. It depends on what your Legion is. If you're running Black Legion, which I think are the best Terminators, I think you still want the Terminators, just for the combi melters and combi bolters, you know, like, and then obviously the 2-up save. Now that we've lost Armor of Contempt, you really can't afford to lose another point of AP because of armor, because then you're actually very easy to deal with, and we can't, then the whole unit sort of just becomes irrelevant, right? So I think if you're running Black Legion, you absolutely want the Terminators. However, an argument could be made in other legions, like Creations of Bile, for example. I think they want the Chosen, because part of Creations of Bile's whole shtick is that they're okay with dying. They don't mind dying, because there's a chance that they're going to get to fight on death anyway, so they're okay with that, you know. Or, you know, there's other legions, like, for example, one of the things you can do with the Chosen is you can put them inside a Rhino, and that way they're protected from that first turn volley, and then that also grants you additional movement. So Emperor's Children, for example, I can see them running a Chosen build instead, because now they're able to go, cool, well, I'm going to disembark 3 inches, then I'm going to move 9 inches, then I'm going to advance 6 inches with Honor of the Prince, so now I've moved up the table 15 inches, and then I'm going to, you know, use my prayer, which I'm going to spend 2 CP to out of command phase, you know, out of phase do my prayer, it automatically goes off, I've put advance and charge on the unit, and now I'm going to charge D6 plus 6, for an average of like, a 9-inch charge. On top of your 15-inch move, you're going 25, 24 inches, and you're down the table. That's really powerful. So the Chosen in the Emperor's Children build are arguably stronger, and they can do this with all of the different prayers and buffs and all that sort of stuff on the unit. But I think in that situation, you're actually building a very different type of list. It's not comparable to the Terminator build, because now you're prioritizing speed and damage output over durability. You're sacrificing the 2-up save. You're probably sacrificing illusory supplication in order to get the advance and charge. You're sacrificing the shooting power of the bolters for the melee damage. Like, you're doing a lot of things there that make it a very different unit and a very different build. So yeah, Chosen are a very good replacement for Terminators in certain builds, but you're not replacing an apple with an apple. You're replacing an apple with an orange, because it's similar points, it's a similar size unit, it's a similar footprint, it's similar in a lot of ways. Its damage output is similar, but it's actually functionally very different because they fulfill a different role. The Chosen missile is different than the Terminator bomb. So yeah, that's the sort of the way to conceptualize it. So when you're looking at whether or not you want to include Terminators, that's sort of the decision you want to make. Do you want to make an anvil of a unit that's really hearty and hard to kill and protects your characters whilst putting out damage, or do you want to build something that's got a missile that's going to go in and go nuclear and fucking take out a whole bunch of stuff? They're different builds. And then on top of that, you want to decide whether or not you want to go undefeated at 8 rounds and really cap off your career with a nice big win, or do you want to just go to the event, have fun, have a few easy games, a few challenging games, and sort of try and place as high as you can whilst accepting that you won't podium? If that's your plan, then yeah, fuck yeah, get on the Terminators. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think the Terminators are dead? Do you think they're they're too expensive now? Do you think the loss of Armor of Contempt is a deal breaker for them? And do you think that the Chaos Space Marines are only really viable when played in an MSU style scrapper army, as opposed to the previous meta for Chaos Space Marines, which was big Terminator bricks and big durable units? Let me know. I'd like to continue this conversation in the comments below. We always have good chats down there. And as always, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers. Alrighty guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all that good shit. And also check out our Patreon, where you gain access to our monthly giveaways and competitions. You also gain access to our Patreon exclusive Discord and the ability to purchase Patreon exclusive dice. We also have apparel like this if you'd like to show your support, and neoprene objective markers. All the links are in the description, and I very much appreciate any support that you're prepared to give. It definitely goes a long way to helping me improve and grow this channel and improve the quality and frequency of the content I'm able to provide for you. So with that being said, we're going to end this video here. Thank you again for tuning in. Thanks for all the support, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Welcome to the Black God.